Hello and welcome to the Fairbank Center. Today we're honored to have Professors Keyu Jin and David Yang here to talk about issues in China's contemporary political economy. So I think I'll go ahead and begin by asking kind of a broad question about China's experience relative to other countries. So China shares a lot in common with developing countries, but also differs in some pretty remarkable ways. Are there lessons that other developing economies can draw from China's 40 years of growth? Note that the party itself has indicated that China's model might not be compatible with other economies. What do you make of this?
So, first of all, I think that stability is very important. Here we're talking not just about macroeconomic stability, but also political stability and social stability. But I think that's a given. I think people understand that very well. What was unique about China's model is that there was a very centralized state, but that was not it. It was politically centralized, but extremely economically decentralized. And there was lots of local governments pushing for reforms. Actually, they initiated the reforms, and they enabled entrepreneurs in the private sector. Now, of course, there are serious challenges to that model we're seeing today, but the role of the state, I think we need to rethink about what kind of role that should be what should be that role, and when should it be more when it should be stronger than other times.
Fascinating. David, do you agree?
Yeah, I very much agree. It's a system that's, as you said, it's centralized on one margin, but also sort of maybe surprisingly decentralized across the board. I think maybe one other aspect that's maybe underappreciated for China being a unique sort of developing country is that it's one of the only places that has this duality that it's a developing nation, but it also has the size of a superpower, which means it has this conflict of interest oftentimes of the medium person in the society might want sort of redistribution and might want a lot of transfers, while from a superpower perspective we'll have a lot of international obligations, international responsibilities, and that sort of pull a lot of the country's attention apart, which you don't have such duality for the US, you don't have such duality for a pure developing country. And this is the first time we're seeing a country of this size but has such duality.
That's interesting.
Can I just add
Yeah,
that I
sure.
think we typically underemphasize the power of the state in this sense: state mobilization, state coordination, state allocation of resources. We tend to think about the government, the role of the government, as being passive in the canonical economic thinking, but I think China has uniquely demonstrated that how you use it, when you use it, could be important, especially for jump-starting growth, but also jump-starting new sectors like new energy sectors, EVs and renewables, etc. China has demonstrated a certain amount of success in that regard.
So there are many in the United States that accuse China of trying to export its model to other countries, and when they say this model, they mean this kind of state-led growth, but combined with more authoritarian tendencies. Um, do you see this as happening? Are other countries able to adopt China's model and implement them?
China never talked about exporting a political model. It has talked about certain lessons of its economic models that could apply to developing countries. Even China itself says that it is so different, it's almost impossible to replicate. But there are certain elements where you want to, invest in infrastructure, you want to have a high saving rate, you want a role of the state. These are lessons for other countries. I think it's not a city upon a shining hill or shining city upon a hill, whatever, however it goes. That kind of American model of democratic universalism of spreading around the world. China had no such ambitions. I don't know if David, you agree.
Yeah, very much. And I will push it on the other direction of I cannot think of a developing example in the recent decades where industrial policy does not play any major role or any major innovation breakthrough that the state does not play any major role. I think we have this myth that sort of
Yeah.
a lot of the innovation is happening from bottom up. It doesn't involve anything but investments. That's not the case for the last sort of century, as we see. So to the large extent that this is how sort of the major breakthrough innovation and the major sort of development miracle has happened. Sort of the China embodied in the form of strong industrial policy, maybe potentially very smart industrial policy, and very strong state-led innovation, there's going to be the misallocation and distortion for sure, but it's also not the extreme that absent of industrial policy, absent of state-led investments, we're going to get sort of magical growth.
Even just to add to that, I mean, even in developing, or sorry, not just developing economies, but in advanced economies, the state has played a huge role in innovation. I mean, look at the United States with DARPA and
Exactly.
the defense
But
agency.
look at now. Read Jake Sullivan's recent speech, and what he's pushing for U.S. economic leadership sounds a lot like China to me. And the CHIPS Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, and of course you mentioned DARPA, but Manhattan Project, Apollo program, that was a whole of a nation program for the U.S. And it was that led the U.S. to really build this great innovation system, and because of competition of the Japanese back then. So I tend to believe that you need some healthy competition to push each other forward. But industrial policies, Americans are having a rethink about what that is, and it's actually pushing the Europeans to do the same.
I think that's exactly right. So there's two things that I want to follow up on this. One is China's innovation ecosystem, and the second is what China has learned from other parts of the world, taking the reverse perspective. So maybe let's tackle the first part of this. Can you describe what China is doing differently in its innovation ecosystem compared to, say, the United States or Europe? What makes China unique in fostering innovation, and what factors have led to the success of things like their battery technologies or their new energy vehicles?
You want to start?
Okay. I think one part of China's innovation sort of success is if we broaden the scope of innovation, right? A lot of innovation is happening in the manufacturing process. It's process innovation. That's the part where China has a huge advantage in, because the closeness of where the manufacturing process is happening. And China, as you mentioned in your book, China is very good at taking sort of existing abstract idea but push it to be a very feasible and profit-making sort of business model, and that type of thing I think could be underappreciated because it's not sort of groundbreaking from 0 to 1, but the sort of oftentimes it takes more efforts and more tinkering to go from one to a feasible business model, and that China has cracked sort of how to do so in many industries. And that requires an ecosystem of having manufacturing sits right next to the businessman, right next to more manufacturing facilities, and they have this very quick feedback loop, which will be the Shenzhen story, for example.
Yeah, I think applications, I think China has mastered it, right? And if you look at today, I mean, it's very ironic, but 4 out of the 5 of the most downloaded apps in the US today are Chinese. I mean, that's mind-boggling. It's very disturbing also. But it's the mastery of, a business model plus digital plus huge amount of data plus the most efficient supply chain in the world. And that China is able to master and also able to penetrate around the world, except for where there are geopolitical concerns. But you have to remember that 90% of the people are still living in developing countries. China's efficiency and therefore low cost / high quality is very useful for these developing countries. And of course, that's not breakthrough technologies, the ones that U.S. can master, and that you require creativity and so an open, free society and all that stuff. But to master high tech, I think China can do very well, even with reverse engineering, which is why I think this whole technological restrictions trying to stop China's mastery of high tech and cutting edge technology will be very porous and leaky. China can do reverse engineering, and of course on the surface there's the scale, there's the finance, there's the talent, but deeper down it's also competition. The fiercest competitive environment maybe in the world for certain products is pushing China to be at the very frontier. And if you win in Chinese market like the EV batteries or EVs itself, you're pretty much at the frontier of the world.
It's interesting, this 0 to 1 and 1 to N distinction that you raise in your book and that David mentioned. In some ways, the U.S. policies seem to be wanting to capture some of that 1 to N, bring manufacturing back and bringing that process knowledge back. Is China going to be able to retain that advantage if it, as you argue in your book, you say that it really needs to focus on the 0 to 1 and build that kind of talent pipeline? Is it possible for China to retain the process knowledge, the manufacturing hub of the world, and simultaneously become this kind of US-style innovation economy?
It's interesting you raise that because I think, at least in Chinese leadership's minds, becoming, let's say, a bigger and smarter, quote unquote, smarter Germany is, in its view, more desirable than the knowledge financialized economy of the US. I'd actually argue that these breakthrough technologies, because you're mastering these very cutting edge technologies, very important, especially in a world where AI is going to dominate. But in China's views, or the leader's view, being able to make real things is somehow really important. So I think in its mind, the triangle of technology of data, AI, and smart manufacturing, communications based on smart manufacturing it's going to help it climb up the value chain in the global supply chain. Can you do these things simultaneously? I think it is a dilemma, because then you really need to change the quality of basic research. You want people to be devoted to the creation of knowledge and have passion about it, so based on intrinsic motivation rather than extrinsic motivation. And in the past, as I mentioned in my book, China grew so fast so that everybody was very short-term oriented and very difficult for them to devote to long-term research and pursuit of knowledge. And to change, you almost have to slow down the economy to reorient the people and have patient people and patient capital. I'm not sure China is there yet, but I do think it is very important.
How about you, David?
I think one yeah, I fully agree. I think one thing to add relates to I guess your question is that the security restriction that other countries, in particular U.S. and Europe, has put on China, try to implement export controls and so on. In part, I think in that regard, U.S. is making a strong bet about choking certain key sort of production processes will stop or significantly slow down China's manufacturing progress. But on the other hand, sort of it's the big uncertainty is that would stimulate China to potentially try to innovate before it doesn't need to sort of make to do those manufacturing in house, given that you could have other sources of supply. And now that you have to do this in house, that might sort of have a leap forward had it not been such restriction. I guess the necessity is always the mother of innovation in that regard. So to some extent, this is the big uncertainty of do you spur more innovation and having actually more sophisticated manufacturing upgrading because of the restriction, or this will actually be a pretty medium run damaging outcome for China. I think this I think time will tell for that.
Yeah, let's talk about the restrictions a little bit more for a moment. So the small yard, high fence program that Jake Sullivan and the Biden administration have kind of developed, they seem to believe that this won't have spillover effects, that it will be contained to just critical technologies that have primarily defense applications. How bad are these restrictions for the Chinese economy in reality? Is this something, in my own work and interviewing Chinese entrepreneurs in China, I heard the sentiment many times that this is really twisting the dagger and hitting China where it hurts. But I'm not so sure if the policy is successful that it will truly have wide-ranging impacts on the Chinese economy. I'm curious what you guys think about this.
Well, as David mentioned, there's going to be a backfiring of these policies, and we're already seeing this national mobilization of resources. We're not talking just about the state. We're talking about rallying together these big tech players to go after these critical bottleneck technologies. Everybody's doing chips, including Tencent, Huawei, Alibaba, Baidu, and so forth. And they are teaming up. They are helping lots of companies manage that reverse engineering. But what's more, you're actually forcing companies or innovators to try to leapfrog or circumvent. And I know many companies in the chip sector that are coming up with alternative design solutions that can circumvent these restrictions and be able to produce equivalently efficient and powerful chips with just domestic capacity. So I think there is that kind of unintended consequence. Now, we don't really have system evidence yet, but you just have to look at historical episodes. I think during the Napoleonic Wars, I don't think England was cutting France off from cotton mills or things like that, and then it just spurred that innovation and that leapfrogging. And we're seeing we're seeing some of that already happening, but also, as David mentioned, the proximity of these semiconductors or chips company to the end users, whether it's AI companies or EV companies, they're all within the vicinity. That kind of very rapid feedback loop, rather than going to the headquarters in the U.S. or Europe, can really spur change and innovation. Just like in Japan, part of the success of the chips semiconductors industry that actually Japan eventually overtook the U.S. was the blossoming of the Japanese electronics business and the end user demand and that kind of loop. So I'm very skeptical of these technological restrictions. I really do think you're forcing, another very great nation with great, or at least a nation with a big potential to leapfrog. And then you talked about the small yard, right? But how small do you want to keep it? Some people are also talking about EVs being a potential to national security threat. So, this discussion can be endless.
Yeah, that's totally right. And actually, on the EV front, I'm curious what you make of the European Union's recent investigations into Chinese battery manufacturing and new energy vehicles. The EU, Brussels has launched a countervailing duty and anti-dumping investigation on alleged unfair state support of the Chinese battery industry. This is an allegation that goes much beyond, it could start at batteries, but many swaths of the Chinese economy could have the same allegation levied against them. As geopolitical tensions are worsening, do you expect to see more of these style of trade frictions cropping up?
Okay, yeah. First of all, look, Chinese government is very fiscally constrained right now. So when we talk about actual real financial subsidies, at least from all the documents that I've read, it's very restricted, very, very restricted in terms of how much they can actually participate. So I think we're talking about an era, especially going forward, where local governments are going to not be in a position to really subsidize en masse these EVs. And I really don't think that was the issue. Ultimately, it's just competition. It's just the sheer competitiveness of the Chinese products. There are something like 300 EV companies in China. First of all, they fight each other to death before they can have maybe one, two, or maybe at most three globally competitive products. And but I think it's going to be very difficult to penetrate the European markets for the reasons that you said. But then you look at how they're doing. BYD. I think the top global share of sales is coming from BYD, immediately followed by Tesla. They're going to Latin America, they're going to Africa, they're going to Middle East. And again, that, competitiveness based on price and quality is it's very compelling. I think Europe has the auto sector is a huge part of its economy, especially in certain countries, and it will fight against global competition. But I think it's also very difficult to prove the actual financial subsidy. And by the way, we're talking about the U.S. What about these subsidies, right? How are we going to discuss about these green tech going forward? I mean, they're going to be subsidized by the U.S. U.S. subsidy to lots of big companies are really quite massive. So I think it's an ongoing dispute that we'll have to face.
I agree. Yeah, I guess one more thing to add, maybe the silver lining coming out of this will be, I think the pessimistic side will be, given the geopolitical tension, you think the clean transition would be the one area where country will have common interest to cooperate, but that's where the fight about, because it touches on so many key industries that really changes the status quo for especially for Europe. So political economy-wise, it's understandable that's the war they're waging. The silver lining of this, I think we don't know enough about sort of when there are strong geopolitical competition and international competition, would that in the end spur more innovation, faster innovation globally, or because it sort of stops some international transfer of technology or human capital, it actually stopped the complementarity in that. You can think about the Cold War, where had there not been a space race, there would not been such fast sort of progress in the space technology innovation from the U.S. and from Soviet. this might be the case where the more fierce international competition in EV battery, in clean energy transition, the world will potentially see faster progress because countries going to put a lot more investments, a lot more incentive to invest and so on. So that might come out as a net benefit for the world coming in a few decades.
Yeah. Yeah, what you were mentioning about the small yard and national security, I think increasingly in Brussels and Washington, the scope of what national security has broadened far beyond what it traditionally has been. And now, if full employment or employment in new and cutting-edge sectors is considered important for national security, then it makes sense why a trade friction might arise on, say, Chinese exports of new energy vehicles. I'd like to talk a little bit about China's role in global trade, and you wrote about this a bit in your book. But there have been allegations or arguments that China is kind of a spoiler in the global trading system, and that the global rules that we have developed are not compatible with the Chinese model of political economy. Fairbank Center's own Mark Wu at Harvard Law School has forcefully made this argument in an article in the called the China Inc. Challenge. I'm curious to what extent you think China does play this spoiler role. Are there things that will need to change in the Chinese economy now that the EU and the United States in particular, but other nations as well, have taken a more forceful stance against Chinese trade practices?
China's trade was a one-time shock. It was a one-time shock to the world economy, and it's kind of pretty much done in that sense of massive scale, cheap labor, kind of products that have flooded the world. Now, we don't need to go into the benefits of the consumer side. We're talking about a huge number of consumers who benefit from cheaper goods, whereas politics often focus on the jobs lost by the steel makers and so forth, especially in this country. But at least some evidence have shown that a lot of the U.S. jobs, let's say, that were displaced by Chinese exports were already at kind of in a very vulnerable position, going to be ousted anyways. These jobs would have moved over to other countries, Mexico, or even potentially Vietnam and others. And if you look at contrasting experience in Europe, it's argued that a lot of these countries that have been subject to the Eastern European shock was much better prepared to deal with the China shock. And the government also put in a lot more resources than the U.S. government in helping their workers transition into other sectors in a smoother way, and retraining, reskilling, etc. But that kind of the story is kind of over. I think dwelling on that is going to miss the point going forward. I actually think going forward, the competition in terms of trade with China is more towards countries like Germany or South Korea that makes higher value-added intermediate goods. Not really a lot of overlap with the U.S. In any case. When we're talking about WTO rules and the framework, yes, I think there is a rethinking. The problem was that in the beginning, when China joined in 2001, it was a very small country by size. And so it was taking advantage of its developing country position, as there were some lax rules for developing countries so that they can grow faster, except that it grew really, really way too big, or it grew very rapidly in a very short span of time. And then everything it did had a big impact on the world economy, and that was a first. And that was what the WTO was not able and prepared to do. But we also have to argue on the developing country side, how satisfied are they with the rules towards them, right? They'd say that a lot of these rules are stacked against them, benefiting the advanced economies and hurting them. And they'd even actually argue that potentially by not letting them progress on the higher value-added, technology-oriented, innovation-oriented, the advanced economies are trying to make them cheap production manufacturing base, while they earn the higher value added, and preventing them from climbing up that ladder. So I think there are multiple sides to the story,
Sure.
but I think a unilateral, bilateral approach rather than a multilateral, as Trump was advocating, is not a solution to the problem.
How about you, David?
I think that I very much concur. I think that the bigger question here is what's the role of international organization, and how I think we see the biggest sort of wedge between the power that's the international organization embodied by the membership country versus the actual power that the country themselves represents. So take the World Bank as example. China is 10-15% of the world's GDP, depending on how you count. China is 6%, 5% of World Bank's voting share. That wedge is not gonna make sort of those organizations sort of sustainable in terms of having coherent internal decision making and representing sort of the power and representing the preferences or divergent preferences of the membership countries. And it's China brought the biggest sort of shock to the wedge between the power since its rise. Because for a long time the organization is very well sort of represented of the actual power distribution. But I think WTO, World Bank, and so on are not adjusting their representation of China. That's in a large part moving forward. Is like how do we think about sort of these international multilateral organizations where not all the members are properly represented in that way.
Yeah, the inflexibility and paralysis, especially at the WTO, but also IMF and World Bank, seems to be a large issue. And I think the WTO, especially considering the return of industrial policy, needs to update its rules. One thing that I've heard several times is that China's extensive state support for certain industries has accelerated the return of industrial policy. And I'm curious, so if we think about, these government guidance funds that I think the semiconductor one, the big fund, has spent something like $800 billion on chips in China. Chips and Science, which passed recently in the United States, spent a fraction of that and was lauded as a huge achievement in industrial policy and research and development. I'm curious what you think the future holds for increased state subsidies, increased industrial policies. What does this mean for the WTO, and what does it mean for U.S.-China relations?
First of all, WTO doesn't say you can't have state subsidies, right? It says that for certain areas, especially when it comes to green tech renewables, obviously you need to have the state support to incentivize the private sector. That's not the issue. The issue is really over the global ramifications of these subsidies and how it affects global competition. But if all the countries are doing it, it's going to be very hard to understand, what the respective impact is. Boeing gets subsidies, and that obviously has international implications, but that's not really what we're fighting about, right? So I think especially when it comes to renewables, not having the state role would help, fail the kind of the green transition that everybody wants to embark on. But I'd say that the size of the subsidies, yes, it sounds really big in China, but the big funds, you want to ask what the achievements have been. And actually, I'd say that it's been very wasteful in some sense because they haven't quite gotten the mixture right between what the role of the state is and how big the role of the market should be. So it's actually a learning process where that whole of a nation program is actually evolving. And from the CHIPS or the big CHIPS, the CHIPS fund, there's now a new thinking, especially in 2023, that's been established to reform this kind of model and to have the market play a much bigger role because they were kind of helping. I don't know if it's subsidies, but just helping lots and lots of a chips company. And if you have a chips company, as a hat, then you get lots of benefits, and obviously that created a lot of waste. And so I would say that was not successful. But the local government guided funds around the country, you would say that you can see that the distribution of the technology companies in China are really all over the country, not just in Beijing, Shenzhen, and Shanghai. And that has a lot to do with the support of local government. But here we're not really talking about financial subsidy. The reason that the financing part is so important, and this is not just direct subsidies, just helping them coordinate bank loan, is how weak and immature the financial system is in China. They don't have the US ecosystem. They can't just raise money and raise capital easily to fund these innovation. It has to be channeled through the state. That's why they have to be very involved. Without that, you wouldn't have that kind of industrial sector. But it's also about helping them attract talent, getting them cheaper land, and then coordinating supply chain. I mean, think about the EVs. One government or many governments helped coordinate an entire supply chain around one company, and that helps a lot. I mean, that company saw 80% rise in production over a year because the battery makers and the manufacturers are all coordinated together. So I think it's that kind of help that the state offers as businesses that has been very critically important, rather than the small amount of actual financial investment. So I think China, to be successful, needs to think about efficiency more than just scale.
Let's return to one of the questions I raised at the beginning of the interview, which was what China needs to absorb or learn from other countries. Do you think efficiency counts as one of those things that China needs to take a cue from other advanced industrial economies? And what else might be missing in China's political economy that it needs to develop or absorb?
So I call this in my book a high growth, high cost model. You saw great performance, but what's the cost behind it? And efficiency is obviously, or the lack of efficiency is a big part of that huge cost. And now, China doesn't have that many resources to waste anymore going forward, being fiscally so constrained. 3 years of pandemic really led to a weakening of the economy in such a serious state, and the high indebtedness. So they have to raise efficiency. And in fact, in the data, we've also seen that the major contributor, or the best contributor to growth, was efficiency improvements through the reduction misallocation, and that has to continue. So I wouldn't call China a very efficient a country, even if it's a very forceful one. David?
I agree. I guess all country would benefit from efficiency, and China would not be exception for this. I think China solved a lot of the sort of the marginal inefficiency problem before, because there's very fierce for local competition, as we discussed earlier. And that channels through sort of the promotion sort of incentive by the local officials, and then providing sort of the right business environment and right sort of help, quote unquote, for the business. And that, I feel, it's potentially dwindling in the recent years. And if to the extent that you decentralize the system to having each local government figure out what's the right industrial mix for the local that would be most beneficial or suitable for the local talents or local economy, with the more limited resources to spare, with the more sort of high demand for efficiency, this has to be the way forward. And I don't think there's anything new China's learning. It's just basically go back to the old route.
Go back to basics, I suppose. So. You also make a big point in your book about human resources and human talent in China. To what extent does improving entrepreneurial mindsets or reforming the education system will have an effect on China's future growth?
First of all, in the recent few months, we've seen really high youth unemployment rate. And that tells you one thing. Apart from the cyclical economic problem, there's a big mismatch between education and skill. And lots of young people have really high degrees, but they can't find the right jobs. At the same time, by 2025, there will be 30 million manufacturing jobs that will be vacant. But these people with college degrees,
Advanced
they don't want. Yeah, they don't want.
Sometimes from foreign institutions.
Yeah, exactly. They don't want to be, lining up in factories or becoming nannies, as some of them do. And so, I think that first and foremost is something you want to solve for the general society as a whole. And then in the end, I think breakthrough technologies, as we mentioned, is really important. So how do you foster that kind of creativity and intrinsic motivation and passion and sustained interest, I think will be critical for China.
I think one thing to add to this will be, I think Scott Rosell in his book, In the Invisible China, make a very, I think, convincing argument that the problem of China's human capital moving forward is not necessarily in the upper tail human capital. It's not even necessarily about retaining the upper tail human capital. It's about sort of the really missing or a lack of human capital in the medium to the bottom end. That's, you sort of need a very large fraction of the population who at least have gone through high school to be able to sustain the middle income country transition and moving out of the middle income path. And that's sort of doesn't get maybe nearly as much attention about sort of some upper tail human capital leaving the country or being able to bring back. But when we're talking about sort of hundreds of millions of people who have potentially graduated from high school and then sort of you cannot sustain the economy without having sort of the backbone of the human capital on average in that level. And China has the lowest number of high school graduates among medium income countries.
I mean, that's some of the paradox of China, right? On the face, it seems in some parts a very advanced economy, in other parts the graduation rates are low, the GDP per capita is low.
But I say that's the big opportunity, right? We tend to think about China as already advanced, but that's just the eastern provinces. That's the big opportunity. 900 million people purportedly living under $300 per month. And as we mentioned, low tertiary education, high education for this big group, hundreds of millions. I mean, imagine what the impact on the world is when you actually lift these hundreds of millions into real middle income, not by Chinese standards, but by international standards. That's the potential, and we have to do all these reforms and these changes to actually make sure that China can meet that potential.
It's awe-inspiring to think when those productive resources are brought to bear, how different the world economy will look. We're approaching the end of our interview, but I'd like to ask one final question, which for myself as an academic, but also for policymakers and for the interested public. What is the one thing that you think most people get wrong about China's political economy that you'd like to set the record straight on?
I think preferences, individual preferences, and tolerance for the role of the state, whereas Chinese people expect the state to play a very big role. In some other societies, it might be considered totally distasteful or undesirable.
David?
I guess one, maybe this might be a sort of a straw man, but it does seem like people have the myth that politics trump everything in China. I think in that perspective, there's no difference between China and the rest of the world, where economy is still is the goal. Even if you don't have a democratic system per se, the government still react very much to the economic pressure, very much react to the incentive, very much react to sort of the Econ 101. I think that lesson oftentimes gets distracted when people sort of read the politics sort of being the priority. And dominates all decisions the governments are making. I think at the end of the day, it's still a country that's developing and still a government that try to survive. And econ is the root of all decision making.